Hello, property nomads. Hope you're doing well. In a recent video, we looked at migrants crossing the border into the USA and taking over empty homes through squatters' rights or whatever it might be. And there's been a recent article, or an interesting article about rent controls. Now, we've covered this about Scotland, for example. They've had rent controls over the last few years and they recently ended. And now there's uproar because all these landlords are increasing their rents quite considerably, which again makes sense because they've been suppressed by some form of intervention over the last few years. And it seems to be that the same thing's been happening in the USA. And this might then explain why there's a lot of empty homes on the market in the USA. I made a comment in the previous video about landlords, landladies, whomever, who maybe should pay a bit more attention to empty homes and things like that. But after reading the rent controls that have been in place, a little bit of it now makes sense where I can understand more of a reason why people might have been leaving certain units empty. So I just want to hold my hands up to that, say every day is a learning day. Let's go and check out this article though, and it's again, this comes from Zero Hedge, a really good website. I do highly recommend you have a look at Zero Hedge. And this was authored by Douglas French of the Mises Institute. And it is basically saying what's happening is that, and I'm sure as you appreciate watching this video, rent control regulations don't work. They don't need to be enforced. They don't work because in effect, it suppresses the market. And it just means that if you put a rent control in, whenever that rent control is finished, then it's like a compressed spring. So you compress, compress, compress. You get rid of the rent control if you ever do, and doing like that, all goes back to free market economics. But again, that increase could be quite vast. Although this article doesn't touch on it, there are things out there about Scotland who, in the last month or two, have got rid of their rent control, which was, I think, capped at 3%, I believe, for private landlords. And what's happening is people are now looking at increases of 15, 20% on their rents because you're just letting the market get back to where the market should be. But it's funny that everyone still seems to want to blame the landlords and the landladies for that sort of stuff, when actually it's government intervention in the first place that has led to those scenarios. And we say time and time again that 9 times out of 10, that when the government goes in and they're trying to protect tenants or the lower class, middle class, whatever class it might be, when they go in and say they're trying to protect them, actually it turns out that their government interventionist techniques end up harming the very people that they're pledging to protect. But it seems that no one ever wants to pick up on this because that would be bad for government, bad for media. So we go back to this article here. Basically, what they're saying, they're basically having to go at rent control, saying it just doesn't work. It points out the difference between rent stabilized unit values and the market rent unit values since the 2019 implementation is startling. Price of New York buildings with at least one rent stabilized unit sold with prices that are 34% lower than in 2019. Price of non-regulated apartments rose by 23% during the same time frame. It won't take a rocket scientist to work out why that's the case, especially if you're trying to sell something and it involves a commercial mortgage where you're basing it on the rental income. And you've got rent controls on one building, so you're limited, or you've got free market operating another, you're going to get more cash for the latter. So that's not a surprise to read. What is challenging is when people start saying, and I quote, "A lot of owners I'm speaking with want to walk away from buildings," end quote. And another quote here is, "My career is over," end quote. I won't get into the political side of this. I didn't in the last video. Again, this seems to be quite a prominent thing in blue states or democratic states in the USA, from what I read. That's my understanding. Because when you're putting in rent controls and you're putting in these things, they're not working. And then when people are then saying that it's not worth me repairing and maintaining these rental units purely because I'm not able to get the return on it, because I'm not able to increase the rent by X amount. I'm limited within these rent controls. Now, the challenge is when you're limited within the rent controls and these situations start to rise to the point where it's not worth renovating and it's not worth putting your cash in to do that because you're not going to get the return at the other end. This then creates a bit of an issue where you are left with empty dwellings. If you're then left with empty dwellings, that creates all sort of economic hiccups. And again, I'll refer back to the video we done recently about migrant TikTokers going into the USA, seizing units as well. So you can see how this all starts to correlate, and it all stems from the top. In this case, it all stems from rent controls being implemented. And what people don't realize is when they're implementing rent controls is it's almost like they're not paying attention to history. They're not paying attention to what's happened before and how it ends out. It normally doesn't end up very well for a lot of people. This article goes on to say that it's not, although this article was focused on New York City itself, the article goes out to point out there's places like Oregon and California, they've instituted rent stabilization as well. Other states apparently considered rent caps. Canada has one, India has one, Sweden have one, Denmark's government's also put one in. Berlin did freeze it for 5 years in 2020, but apparently that measure was overturned at a later date. And straight out of Ludwig von Mises's book, one government intervention does lead to others. So we can see there, again, we'll put a link to that article in the show notes. Again, what we're seeing here is that rent controls aren't working. Rent controls don't work, full stop. And the thing is, when government try to get in and do one thing, that normally leads to more government intervention and more and more and more. It becomes a snowball effect. And as we said at the start of the video, normally that means that the very people that they're out to protect are going to be the ones that end up coming worse off. But it seems that no one ever likes to report on that because, hey, for some reason, people never want pushback on mainstream media or government. So go figure that one out. That's all I can say. That being said, if you could do us a small favor, please do like and subscribe to Property Nomads YouTube channel. We're seeing the content grow, which is really, really good. We're going to look over the next months and so forth. We're going to be looking at more, plan Bs because they're becoming incredibly more prevalent given everything that's going on or bubbling under the surface at the moment. And we're going to be giving more practical information on that stuff as well. Not just me moaning about housing or moaning about the councils here in the UK, although that is good fun to do. And there's an audience for that, which is nice. I'm going to become more constructive, I think, with our approach. And of course, battling against mainstream media and giving you the truth about what's going on out there rather than all the mainstream media BS that, we're fed day to day. So thanks for liking the channel. Thanks for subscribing to the channel. Please tell everyone else about it as well. It's really, really useful. And as a result of you doing that, we're seeing the channel grow. So big thank you for doing that. I'll see you in the next video.